Hello everyone. In the last lecture we discussed about the role of legislature, that is parliament, in the policy implementation. Okay, and this role of parliament in policy implementation was discussed by highlighting at least the responsibility of three committees. The first one we discussed about the public account committee, and the second the committee on estimate, and the third we discussed about what is the role of public undertaking committee. Okay, so that gives a perspective that how legislature, that is parliament, is influencing, or the legislature is involved in the policy implementation stage. Okay, so today we will be discussing policy implementation by the other agents and organizations, like policy making, policy implementation in judiciary, role of bureaucracy in policy implementation, interest group politics and policy implementations, and also we will be highlighting some of the problems related to policy implementations, emphasizing what is effective public policy implementations and what are the factors that may impact the effective policy implementation, along with what are the conditions that may lead to successful policy implementation. Okay. So, let us discuss the first one, that is judiciary in policy implementation. So, we understood what is the role of the legislature, that is parliament, in policy implementation. Now, we will be discussing the judiciary in policy implementation. Okay. So, many times we can also find some examples like the judicials or judiciary organizations like courts, right. So, they influence the policy implementation or through their judicial decisions. Okay. So, the judicial bodies, they can help, they can delay, they can obstruct, they can nullify the implementation of any particular policy through the techniques like interpretation of statutes and decisions as well, through the judiciary decisions as well. Okay. So, for example, suppose say a particular policy is going to be implemented, that means the policy has already legitimized. Okay. So, after getting the status of the legitimized, or you can say after that particular proposal becoming the law, so now the policy is going to be implemented. Okay. But however, there are some groups, they are not in favor of implementation of this particular policy. So, what they can do, they could not stop during the policy formulation stage, but they can stop, or they can obstruct, or even they can nullify the implementation of that particular policy during the implementation stage. Okay. So, what they have to do or what are the tools that is available to them, that is through the filing of PIL. So, what is this PIL? PIL is known as the public interest litigation. So, this is a tool in which can help the policy implementation, which can help in obstructing the policy implementation or even delaying or nullifying the policy implementation as well. Okay. So, in this context, I would like to highlight the role of the Supreme Court as a part of the highest form of the judiciary organization. So, the Supreme Court is empowered to issue writs, or any individual can move to the court for the protection and safeguarding of his or her rights. Okay. So, again, if any policy is found to be creating any problem, or it infringes the fundamental rights of a particular person, then that particular person can go to the court of law. Okay. And the Supreme Court is empowered to issue writs, right, and help the individuals or persons, those who are facing these problems. So, this is how the policy can be obstructed, the policy can be nullified, the policy can be delayed as well. So, the next organizations that we can think about is bureaucracy in policy implementation. So, this is the very essential part or primary part in the policy implementation, that is the executive branch or the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is considered, of course, as I told you, that it is an executive branch of the government, and it does day to day activities or day to day work of the government, and it takes care, or it controls the personnel, the officials, the manpower, the resources, the materials, the legal powers of the government as well. Simultaneously, it receives most of the implementation directives from executives, from legislative or judicial decision makers as well. That is the reason the bureaucracy must anticipate policy needs, right, develop the alternative course of actions, and also it should anticipate what would be the appropriate instrument in implementation of a particular policy. Okay. So, for example, let us say that the government of India is targeting to implement PM Surya Ghar Yojana, right. So, what is the target? The target is that every household should be having electricity, okay, electricity through solarization of households, and through solarization the household should get the electricity. Okay. So, now this policy is to be implemented. Let us say it should be implemented in a case like a small state like Uttarakhand, it is a hilly state. Okay. So, what is the role of the bureaucracy? The bureaucracy's role is, initially the bureaucracy should set some target that how many households is targeted to get this provision, the provision of this policy. Okay. So, what is the targeted number? Okay. And the second one is the time period, that within 6 months or within a year or within 2 years, that this much of households should be getting the facility or benefits from PM Surya Ghar Yojana. Okay. And let us say that while implementing and while following up, let us say that within 6 months the targeted households is not achieved, then of course the bureaucracy must take the actions, right, must understand the course of actions of the implementation phases, and it must identify what could be the alternative instrument or what could be the best alternative instrument that can be used for the implementation process, so that the targeted number of households can be achieved within the targeted number of years. Okay. So, that is the role of these instruments, that whether it is through making awareness or it is through, let us say, changing the behavioral aspects or through economic incentives like subsidies or what else. So, it is the bureaucracy which needs to discuss, which needs to strengthen the exposure of instruments that is available to them for that particular policy, and should identify out of all these instruments or out of which instrument is the best or appropriate instrument for the implementation of this particular policy. Okay. So, theoretically if you see, it appears that the political machinery sets the national objectives and priorities, right. And what is the role of this bureaucracy? The role of the bureaucracy is to implement the same, get the directives of the priorities from the national objectives and national priorities, and implements the same. So, political machinery has already set the national objectives and priorities, and also decides which are the important policies that should be implemented in order to achieve the national priorities and national objectives. Okay. So, the political machinery also adopt different developmental plans, allocate resources, and it is the responsibility of the bureaucracy to plan in accordance with the political directives that is already established here or communicated here. Okay. So, the public administration, if you see, so they are treated as a discipline, and majorly the civil servants, so they are mainly concerned with this policy implementation after getting the directives, after getting all these processes set. Okay. So, that means the implementation part, so far the policy implementation is concerned, although the policies are shaped by the national objectives, priorities and the political machinery, but the implementation is largely rested on the bureaucracies through its bureaucratic experiences, mechanisms and tools. So, since we are discussing that what are the different organizations and that can also be involved in policy implementations, right. So, one of the organization that we can think about is interest group. Sometimes it is also known as pressure group or advocacy group. Alternatively, all these are used. And again it is context specific, that whether we should use a pressure group or interest group or advocacy group. Generally in some cases we think about pressure groups are the subset of interest groups, okay, or advocacy group is also subset of interest group, but many times we are interchangeably using this concept interest group, pressure groups and advocacy group. So, but one thing that is clear from their characteristics of all these three concepts is that it is an organized body of members or individuals. And what is the common thing about all these, that they share common issues and they also actively work to influence the public policy and government decisions. Okay, and for achieving for influencing public policy and influencing the government decisions, they adhere to different tools, like they can go for lobbying, right? They can mobilize public support and public awareness. They can go for litigations as well. Okay, so these are some of the activities they do to influence the public policy and government decisions. Okay, so the main objectives of the interest group is to advocate for a particular concern or highlight a particular issue and achieve the target. Okay, so some of the very dominant interest groups in India that we can find nowadays is trade unions, right? Agricultural cooperatives, the Indian medical associations, and we can find out so many other groups as well. But if you see the characteristics, then we can find that they advocate for specific cause. The trade unions advocate for specific cause, whereas the medical association, they have also their targeted causes. Okay, so given this understanding of this interest groups or your advocacy groups, so we can find the powerful interest groups. They pursue their interest at every stage of the policy making, not only policy formulation but also policy implementation stage, and they try to affect the administration as well in order to achieve the specific causes they are advocating. Okay, and political parties, they also affect the policy implementation process along with these interest groups, right? So, as I told you that there could be many interest groups, and some of the examples here we are highlighting for just your knowledge, that these are the names that we are frequently hearing, right, through news. Okay, Narmada Bachao, Confederation of Indian Industry, right? All these are the different interest groups and they are advocating for specific causes. Okay. So, given this understanding of how the policy implementations are influenced by different players, right? So, now we can identify what are the problems we can encounter or generally are encountered during the public policy implementation. Why we are thinking so? Because it is by our experience, we are finding that perhaps policy making is easier, but policy implementation is really very tough. Okay, so I would like to quote Woodrow Wilson, right? He was the then president, 28th president of the USA. So he also remarked that it is getting to be harder to run a constitution than to frame one. So that actually highlights that making a constitution is relatively an easier task in comparison to running or implementing the rules that is already written in the constitutions. So from this we can find out what is the gravity of this particular problem, that is policy implementation. So what is the biggest problem we are finding? So if you see, policy formulation is done by the group of officers, largely that happens in the secretariat, but where is it implemented? The policy, a particular policy is implemented in the targeted field area, right? So the formulation is done somewhere and implementation is done somewhere else. Okay, so that is perhaps the first source of problems that we are finding in the policy implementation. So policy implementation, of course, it requires cooperation because it is formulated in one place by some set of stakeholders, and the implementation is done somewhere else where the stakeholders were quite different and quite diverse. Okay, and for implementation, because policy formulation is done here, right, at the central level or at the subnational level, but largely implemented in the targeted areas, let's say in a local areas. So for that reason, we need to have cooperation from the central to state to the local. So that means all the forms of the government must be in a coordinating or cooperating process, then only policy implementation would be fine, otherwise there are problems. So it is because of the federalism structure of the governance, again we can find that the policy implementation is a problem. So for policy implementation we require cooperation, coordination and commitment at all levels of the implementing machinery, from central government to the local government. And again, for policy implementation, the biggest role is on the implementing agencies or the local field officers who are implementing the policy, right. So that is the reason we need to make these field officers, right, and equipped with all the types of resources, not only the skill but also the other types of resources like financial, right, technical, all these resources must be provided to the field officers, because they are the, what you can say, the key persons in policy implementations, okay. So and if we are not doing so, because many times we are finding that there is lack of efficiency, the lack of resources available to the field officials, then of course there is a problem in the policy implementation. So the other problem could be that we need to understand and discuss the operation process of policy, right. So the policy operation process must be understood and must be discussed at the stakeholders level, okay. And if before implementing, the implementers or the implementing agency is not going to discuss, has not discussed that what is the target of the implementation of the policy, or what should be the operation processes, then again the implementation is going to be quite hectic, okay. And that is the reason we need to think about the capacity and capability of the administration, okay. And this capacity can be, the administrative capacity must be adequate enough to implement a particular policy, otherwise the policy implementation would be a tough task. So similarly, under this administrative capability, we need to also take into account another factor, that is administrative leadership. That if a team of, let's say, 12 member team is engaged in the implementation of a particular policy, then everyone should be knowing what is their exact role during the implementation processes, right. And there should be a leader who needs to take care of all these, that who are given what responsibility, and if any contingent kind of situation arises, then what needs to be done. So this administrative leadership is a must, and without this planning, if the team is going for implementation, then again this is a problem. And since I told you that the leader and along with the team must understand the degree of uncertainty, right. If there is any kind of risk and uncertainty happens, then what should be the level of actions that can be taken, okay. So that shows the dynamism. It is not like static kind of information should be there, rather all the dynamic information and dynamic aspects must be adhered by this implementing team, otherwise there would be a problem in the policy implementation. So the other factors which also creates problem is communication. Basically miscommunication or a bad communication is a hindrance in the policy implementation. So there could be this kind of communication can be for different stakeholders, right, starting from the union government to the local government. So the appropriate amount of communication or good communication skills should be there, so that all may be communicated in a right way and for the implementation of the policy, okay. So apart from all these problems that we discussed here in policy implementation, we can also think about some other problems which are highlighted, okay. So those problems are again crucial, and it should be handled by the leader of the implementation team. So for example, we can think about political will, right. For implementation of any policy, there should be political support and political will. Without it, it is very difficult to get the policy implemented in right spirit. Or sometimes we are finding that let's say a particular policy was implemented by the earlier government, ex government, and now the regime changes after the election. So it is the case of just like 1 month. Okay, so after 1 month we are finding that there is another government. Okay, so the regime changes. So here the next political party in power is Y, right? So this process, this change in regimes also puts an hindrance in the policy implementation. So here we are finding there is a particular policy A, right? And we know that what is the allocation of resources and what is the target year of implementation for the completion of the implementation of this particular policy. Now after this, after the regime change, when Y government has come, so completely we are finding there is a different picture, right? So the policy implementation can be influenced to a greater extent. So all these targets, all these processes, all this speed and dynamism may be affected because of the change in regime. So that needs to be taken care. If a particular policy is already implemented by the previous government, right, and if it is a well spirited policy, then it should be continued in the next government as well. Okay, so some of the other problems that I'm just highlighting, you can find it is self-explanatory in fact for the policy implementation, like leadership, effective communication, efficiency, inadequate information or even distorted information, right? So all these are the crucial problems that may create hindrance in public policy implementation. So some of the other reasons or other factors can be institutional structure, corruption, lack of no coercive actions or alternative sources of regulations, alternative regulations, lack of dedicated staffs at different tiers of the governance. Okay, so given this broad understanding of the problems that we may encounter in the policy implementation, now we can think or we can also identify the problems related to the conceptual, political and administrative aspect in the policy implementations. Okay, so let's understand what are the problems that can arise because of the conceptual problems, or because it is so conceptual only, or it is because the problem is political, or the problem is administrative in nature. Okay, so initially when we started with public policy implementation, so this public policy implementation was the subject matter of the public administration. Okay, so gradually we felt that this politics should be separated from administration. Initially the public policy implementation was under the scope of public administration, right? But gradually we try to separate politics from administration, right? And since we separated politics from administration, it was thought that it is the cause behind the scientific approach to the administration. Okay, and that is perhaps the reason. From our experience and observation, we perceive that politics and administration cannot be separated, but however we have already separated. Okay, so that is the reason we are finding some kind of problems. Okay, and those problems are known as the conceptual problems in public policy implementation, because public policy implementation was largely the subject matter of public administration, but however we are separating politics from administration, right? And we are thinking that it is by separating these two we can give a scientific approach to the administration. Okay, so as a result we are finding some problems, and because of this conceptual problem. Okay, and sometimes the opponents of a particular policy, they do not even end their opposition after the law is passed. Okay, so they continue their opposition after the passing of laws as well. So during the enforcement level they try to create hindrances. They continue their opposition in the implementation phase of the policy processes by opposing in the process of implementation against the organization or agency who is given the responsibility to implement, or the organization or agency who are funding the policy, or providing the staff, or doing direct and indirect coordination in the program. So they continue to oppose all these, right, during the implementation process. Okay, and the opponents, if they are not successful in halting or in delaying the policy implementation, so what is the next level they can do? They may go to the court of law in order to linger the policy implementation, so that it can continue, that it is halted now, right, the implementation is halted now. Perhaps in many newspaper we get to know that the progress of this particular plan or the policy is halted because someone has filed APIL. Okay, so the decision will be taken in future. So here we can find the ineffective or corrupt political leadership can also be one of the factor in poor implementation of the policies. Okay, sometimes we can find there could be over ambitious policies are framed just to incentivize the voters, but in reality, so the party or the, what you can say, the government, particularly the political party in power or the government, may also lack resources or support system in for executing those policies. Okay, so that can also happen, but just to win the election or just to incentivize the elections, they sometimes come with very over ambitious policies which is lacking adequate funding resources or adequate funds or even the support system. Okay, so if it is so, don't you think about that, how it is going to create problems in implementations. Okay, so the other problems could be the lack of requisite manpower and financial resources, political influences on bureaucracy, the challenge of keeping away personal interest, prejudice and politics. All these are self-explanatory, that how this could be hindrances in policy implementations, right? Or you can think about implementations problems related to politics, values, institutions and expectations, and also the budgets. Okay, so all these are challenging factors that may create hindrances. But since I told you that some of the factors are related to conceptual, political and administrative, we can identify that which are the factors. It is under the conceptual factors in implementation of the policy, or political factors in implementation of the policy, or the administrative factors. Okay, so at last we need to understand what is known as the effective implementation, right? So you can see the PIB notifications. Government is making policies for people's welfare, but effective implementation of this policy is crucial. Okay, so that is the concern of the then Vice President, okay, of India. So what is the emphasis and why there is an emphasis on effective implementation? We are just discussing about the policy implementation, and here there is an emphasis on the effective policy implementation. So what is this effective policy implementation? Okay, so for every policy there is a target, there is a broad goal, and there are specific targets. Okay, and effectiveness means producing the desired results. That means if there are some policies, so these policies have some targets. Okay, so these targets are also called the results. Okay, desired results. If the policies are able to achieve these desired results within the mentioned time frame, then we can say that the said policy is effective, or effective policy implementation has been undertaken. Okay, so effectiveness means producing desired results. Okay, so effective policy implementation, it entails what? Implementing a policy in such a way so that it can produce, it can attain, it can realize the goals and objectives of the policy. As I told that every policy has some objective, has some goals and specific objectives. Okay, so the effective policy implementation is what? That the policy should be able to achieve, to attain, to realize the goals and objectives of that particular policy. Okay, so we may say that if a policy attains its desired goals, or if, then we can say that effective policy implementation is achieved. Okay, but the problem is that since we are saying policy implementation and effective policy implementation, so do you think that, or there could be, the discussion could be like this, that every policy implementation is not effective? That is perhaps the reason we are emphasizing on the effective policy implementation. Okay, because every policy may not achieve the targeted objectives that is already set for that particular policy. So in that case, we need to explore that what are the factors that may influence the effective policy implementation. Okay, the first factor, by doing a literature review, we can find the first factor which may impact the effective policy implementation is the complexity and type of the problem that is addressed through that particular policy. So if the policy is dealing with a very complex issue, and depending upon the nature of the policy also, the effectiveness of the policy is said to be achieved or not achieved. Okay, so if the problem that the policy is addressing is really not very complex, it is one to one, or every multiple directions of these policies has already been explored and accordingly the policy has been designed, then the policy is likely to be effective. Okay, or policy implementation is likely to be effective. Okay, so the complexity of the problem and the type of the problem, okay, so that impacts the implementation, effectiveness of the policy implementation. Okay, many times we are finding the policy is really ambiguous, right? So it is not clear. If the policy is not clear, then how can you think about the implementation would be effective? Again, the implementation is not effective. It again depends on the magnitude of the expected changes. Suppose say we are targeting to achieve a growth rate, economic growth rate, okay, from let's say 3% to let's say 3.5% or 4%, okay. And with an appropriate policy, we can think about effectiveness of the policy. That means maybe within a year we can achieve this target, okay, if our preparation and targets are well defined, our efforts are well defined. Okay, but if you are thinking about that right now the growth rate is 3% and next year we are targeting a growth rate of let's say 9% or a double digit, let's say 10%, right? So the magnitude of expected change is really high, right? As a result, the targeted policy or the policy that targets to achieve these particular objective, so it may not be successful. Okay, so the magnitude of the expected change and the group that we are targeting through this policy is also very crucial in effective policy implementation. Again, which group, that whether the group has the dynamism to accept and adopt the benefits through this policy, or they are very hostile to any policy or any developmental exposure, then again the policy implementation is not going to be success in the second case. So the other factors could be, and again these factors are self-explanatory, just let me know if you find any difficulties, then again through our exercises, weekly exercises, right, weekly assignment will be clarifying those as well if you find any, but all these are self-explanatory. So for example, the other factors are the human and financial resources devoted to implementation, the administrative structure and regulation that will put in place to support the policy implementations. Okay, we can think about what are the type of policy network already established over the year for policy implementations. Okay, so all these are some of the factors that are likely to be affecting the policy implementation to be effective. Okay, so after understanding this, the last one that we are really interested to understand further is what kind of conditions that must be created for successful policy implementation. The first condition that must be provided, must be created for successful policy implementation is qualified manpower and knowledge. Okay, so many times we are finding the policy is not like one to one, is rather a dynamic one. Okay, so all these dimensions must be explored. Okay, so that kind of exploration can be understood or can be observed and again integrated by qualified manpower and knowledge. Simple and robust process, rules and laws, clear policy statements, no ambiguity, prevention of outside interferences, right? Control over implementing actors. The links in the chain of implementation structure should be kept minimum. That means here it speaks about the networks. Okay, managerial and political skills to implement. Okay, so again it depends upon the managerial skills of the officials and agencies, those who are given the responsibility for the implementations. Dynamism, flexibility and adaptability of the agencies in case of their risk or changing situations. Communication networks. So all these are the conditions, or these things must be enabled, right, should be created for successful policy implementation. So if I think all these are self-explanatory, explained, right? They are self-explanatory. But still, if you find any difficulty, then just let me know through the weekly assignment tasks. Okay. So these are the references you can go through. So these are some implementations aspects, right? These are some e-resources and the practical implementation aspects that you can go through. Thank you very much.